This is part two. I'm not sure if there's going to be three or four or five. There's so much material, and I apologize that it's a little disorganized. I'm going to be a little disorganized because I think the need is there and the need is immediate. And there's some information that I just feel like I have to get out there right away. I don't know why exactly. Certain people need to hear it. The main thing I think people need to hear and take away is really Marxism is not a kind of spontaneous manifestation of a kind of demon-possessed insanity that takes hold of people. Yeah, that's the result of it. You really have to understand where it comes from. It comes from imperialism. It is a tool of imperialism. As I've said in other videos, I think I mentioned, echoing Dr. Webster Tarpley, Marx was a British agent. He was, according to Dr. Tarpley, he was spoon-fed his ideas by David Urquhart. David Urquhart was one of the top oligarchs in the British oligarchy, which is a kind of reiteration of the Venetian oligarchy in the way it functioned and its methodology. So David Urquhart was also the ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, and he was a devout, rabid Russophobe. And he played a huge role in Marx's development. I found a little more information on that, where Karl Marx derived a lot of his ideas from the British Haileybury School, which I don't know much about. I just saw this reference and jotted it down. But he was greatly aided also from the British Haileybury School, greatly aided by his British intelligence patron, David Urquhart. And Karl Marx apparently first encountered David Urquhart in the British Library. Urquhart had been a key British Foreign Service operative deployed to the Transcaucasus and the Balkans. Urquhart's connection to Marx came about through Urquhart's function as an administrative figure in the BFS in operations in which he coordinated the Young Europe and Young America, Young Italy. Maybe you're familiar with these terror networks, essentially psychological terror networks being run under the direction of Lord Palmerston's London-based agent and control agent for Marx, Giuseppe Mazzini, who I think was also responsible in large measure for introducing the mafia into the United States. But in this way, Marx became Urquhart's pawn in an internecine conflict between himself, Urquhart, and Lord Palmerston, Russia. Marx was a Russophobe. In fact, in a lot of Marx's writing, you can find examples of atrocious Russophobic inclinations, which is, I think, somewhat embarrassing to Russians who still hold to or still cleave to. Not that there were, well, I'm not going to get into that, but it's a source of embarrassment for a lot of Russians still enamored of Marx. But you know, Lord Palmerston was running his three big pawns or chess pieces. They were more than pawns. You had Giuseppe Mazzini, you had Napoleon III, and you had David Urquhart. And they didn't often work in perfect harmony with one another. They weren't always working in concert, and they were stepping on each other's toes and occasionally trying to stab each other in the back. So there was one episode in which David Urquhart induced Marx into writing this long-winded expose which represented Palmerston as a Russian agent. So I think it's pretty well established. People need to know Marx is not... even I have friends who were educated in Mongolia, but during the Soviet period, and they have this view of Marx as this tireless, impoverished, dedicated man who threw his soul into this life's work, which was the uplifting of mankind and the eradication of societal ills. And they're, by and large, completely ignorant of the provenance of Marx's ideas and the people who backed him and ultimately used him as a kind of battering ram to bring Russia, to make Russia more malleable to Western imperialist influences, despite all appearances. The painting that you see here is called Devyataya Valna, which translates as the Ninth Wave. It's by Russian-Armenian painter Ivan Aivazovsky, and it was painted in 1850, and it's apparently his most famous work. But the expression Ninth Wave is apparently an old sailing expression which refers to a wave of incredible size that manifests after a succession of incrementally larger waves. You get this buildup and this crescendo and this ninth wave, which I think is maybe emblematic of what we're seeing today, a ninth wave coming along. So I think I love this painting, and I've seen a lot of his work. Interestingly, I hadn't seen this one until I went looking for a good thumbnail for this video. Oh, look here. I'd wanted to just continue reading this article in part one, but a lot of it I didn't feel was particularly germane, and the things I really wanted to get to. So I'm skipping ahead, but I see here just before the place where I intended to continue reading, there's, "Thus, on such account, our nations are like ships of fools headed toward a common shipwreck." Kind of interesting, given my choice of artwork for this video. Continuing. "We were set upon the course toward ruin long ago, but most emphatically in our toleration of foolish policies of arms control, post-industrial utopianism, and the radical counterculture during the recent 20-odd years. Under these conditions, the moral and intellectual qualities of the populations generally, and leading religious and other private institutions as well as political ones, have been eroded considerably. The population and leading institutions have fled from a rational comprehension of an historical process into those flights of fancy which are centered upon very narrow, more or less hedonistic interests centered about Adam Smith's irrationalist pursuit of pleasure and avoidance of pain. The pain-pleasure principle figures very highly in British empiricism. Keeping in mind, again, this article is 1988. So, brought to the rim of the greatest catastrophe in the modern history of this planet, and brought so by the habits we've acquired during the preceding decades, we march toward the nearing brink, governed by those acquired habits. Such is the work of Satan and his great mother Shakti Ishtar Isis, the whore of Babylon. Respecting that Venetian party which esteems itself the modern gods of Olympus, once the members of that, and again, I urge people to understand that the Venetian party is not dead. Many of these families are thriving today and have tremendous influence. So this is not some kind of historical reference. Once the members of that party chose to deem themselves the virtual gods of Olympus, respecting the affairs of nations and individuals on this planet, they doomed themselves to their Götterdämmerung not by choosing that end, but rather by choosing the collective and individual character which foredoomed them to such a fate. To the degree that we submit to their rule of society, we doom ourselves to share that fate. Excuse me. In various ways, I hear a lot of people today echoing or providing their own iterations to what I just read about the dangers of submission. To the degree that we submit to their rule of society, we doom ourselves to share that fate. And one way that we are induced to submit is to be ignorant of their methods. And that is really what is providing me the impetus to go ahead with this. Thus, they are gripped by a force which it is beyond their free will to control. I think that's very important. We look at these Venetian nobility and the southern tier and the northern tier. We see they are gripped by a force beyond their own free will. They've been conditioned this way for centuries, as we've been conditioned. And my understanding of Satanism is that it deprives you of free will. You become a slave. So I think we can perhaps see an opportunity to make progress in this conflict if we understand that those Venetian families and those who are operating in concert with them, they're also deprived of their free will. They've really given themselves entirely over to the black magic. To the extent that we others are habituated to let those would-be gods of Olympus act as the playwrights and stage managers of our living drama, and persist in those habituated assumptions of belief and behavior congruent with such submission, we too are without true free will, caught like mere marionettes in the grip of forces beyond our power to control. So when people resist and don't want to listen when I talk about the origins of Marxism, it's because they're in love with hating this phantasm that they've built up in their minds. And they don't want to be broken free from that. So in a sense, they're persisting in habituated assumptions, thus deepening their own mental servitude to a system that, although they complain about it, they rail against it, they're powerless to do anything about it because their beliefs about the nature of what they're fighting are erroneous, misguided, not based on history. And they see history, unfortunately, as a series of sort of discrete events that sort of spontaneously bubble up, and then the bubble bursts and another one bubbles up, and oh my God, it's so chaotic. They don't detect a through line, and they almost resist being led to look at, hey, look, there's a through line here. You can trace things, some of these things, right? You can trace it fairly easily going back a couple thousand years. It's not difficult. Satan and his mother are the puppet masters of this stage. Should we awaken and look up, and by aid of the methods of Socratic dialogue, we shall see those two malefactors clearly enough to do what we must do. We shall then pull upon those very strings by means of which they would control our will, and so bring them down. Makes a lot of sense. Pull on those strings with which they're attempting to control you. Give them a good tug. But you can't do it if you don't perceive these strings, these strands, and that includes a clear-eyed understanding of causality here. So, People's War. From the beginning of its existence, the principal goals of Soviet Moscow have been the conquest of Germany and the destruction of the United States by aid of acquiring Germany's productive potential. You see this kind of playing out kind of right now, right? Some people have said this whole conflict in Ukraine is really an attempt to make sure that Germany and Russia do not join forces. And we see the destruction of the United States ongoing. It looks as though Trump is going to run for office again, and he seems pretty confident that he's going to be in the White House again, but we don't know what he's going to do. At least I don't. Looks good on the surface. But what's going on underneath? And I mean, if there's another thing I'd like people to keep in mind is that there is we're looking at the skin of this beast, and there's muscles underneath we don't see, muscles and sinews that I think we can associate with these old oligarchical interests, things that people are completely unaware of, and they're looking at the kind of the surface politics, the theater. So this included the intention to develop military means for destroying us, and that has never changed. However, even long before the first Soviet Roman legions were essayed against us, Moscow was at war with us, a war begun long ago, which has never ceased. I don't know what that is exactly. I'm not an expert. I'm only uncovering things as I find them. I have certain convictions. I see certain patterns. I think they're terribly important, but please don't confuse me with an expert. Maybe in a few years I'll be a kind of a specialist. Beijing's Lin Pao called it People's War, as we saw this in the vast genocide against the people of Cambodia. Lin Pao discovered nothing. People's War was the policy adopted by the Kuomintang for resistance against the Japanese invasion during the 1930s. In Europe and the Americas, we call it today irregular warfare, as the text of Brigadier General Professor August von der Heydte has clarified the definition. There is a flaw in Clausewitz's famous text. The point is, summed up, by our insisting that regular warfare is cultural warfare supplemented by regular military means. Such is the ongoing war conducted against the United States, its friends and allies, by Moscow today. I'd be inclined today to maybe qualify that and say it's the deep state. We know there was MI6 was present at the or guided the founding of the KGB. We know, I'm fairly certain that various mind-controlled methods used by the Soviets against the United States had their origins, or certainly you can see it mirrored in the kind of technologies, if you want to call it, techniques employed by Tavistock. I think probably the combined interests of the combined interests of the British oligarchy serving as kind of administrative agents of the continental oligarchy, the older, more powerful aristocracy, has nothing to do with countries now. They don't care about countries. That's just a kind of an artificial grid they lay on top of their own designs and use countries as sort of chess pieces as well. So anyway, I'm going off track. I think you see what I'm getting at here. Let's review the most relevant set of facts. Accepting Allied actions in defense of elements of the former Tsarist Empire, which the Bolsheviks were in the process of subjugating during the period immediately following the October 1917 insurrections in Petrograd and Moscow, there has never been a shooting war which involved directly opposing regular military forces of the United States and USSR. Many who do not understand the nature of warfare believe wrongly that the absence of shooting war between regular forces means that a state of peace exists between the relevant nations. Throughout the past 70 years, the shooting wars fought between the Soviet Union and the United States have been wars involving Soviet military and terrorist surrogates. Such surrogate warfare does not represent a state of peace. Of course, we know that goes both ways. And our job, once you know that, the job then is to dig down and find out who's behind all of it. Who's pulling these little strings all over the place. Soviet-directed surrogates have assassinated many figures who were nationals of the United States, allied states, or friendly nations. This activity has been escalating since the period Washington and Moscow negotiated recent INF and other détente agreements. That is not a state of peace. In the absence of warfare between the regular military forces of the two powers, there has been a presently escalating state of warfare between the two powers, with the initiative, the aggression, if you please, chiefly on the side of Moscow. That's changed, right? This state of warfare, there's a double. It's like China, the United States, and Russia. They have a dual nature that's created by the infiltration, the penetration by the international deep state, which is controlled by these aristocratic interests. This state of warfare is the conduct of global people's war. So you can look at the Bolshevik Revolution, you can look at the Maoist Cultural Revolution, you can look at, in a very small, limited and pathetic, the George Floyd riots, I think, the Jacobins, anything resembling that, Antifa, BLM. This state of warfare is the conduct of global people's war, a form of warfare ultimately more terrible than a full-scale nuclear conflict, and implicitly just as mass murderous as in the case of the genocide just as the case of the genocide in Cambodia attests. There is no peace, nor any likelihood that peace is about to break out in the relations between our states. The war is not only ongoing, but is being escalated. There can be no peace. Even if we were to surrender to Moscow, they will not rest until all that our nation has represented is eradicated from the memory of this planet, root and branch. Well, you can see distortions in public education, and you can see evidence of it on social media, where the founding fathers of the United States are slandered unfairly and with kind of, I think it's a deliberate distortion of history. People say if you fall prey to believing that they were just a bunch of racist slave owners and psychopaths, that you're succumbing to British disinformation. I'm inclined to urge people to accept that as truth, just because of all the reading I've done. But of course, you shouldn't accept anything. It would be better to dig into it. But you can see how the ideas of the founding fathers, how the Constitution has been gradually demoted to a kind of my God. A few years ago, they had this designation of people defending the Constitution as constitutionalists. They were put on watch lists. I mean, this is outrageous. So you see how what our nation has represented is being eradicated. We don't see it so much emanating from Moscow, although if you go back and you can say, well, you can show how, factually, how this was done, you could probably trace the efforts in Moscow to carry this out. You could probably trace it to MI6. There can be no peace unless we awaken to the nature of our planetary tragedy and pursue that course which, by freeing us from that tragedy, creates the preconditions for future durable peace. Look more closely at the nature of people's war. Start with the case of the grisly genocide perpetrated by Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge. Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge marched perhaps more than 1 million defenseless Cambodians out of the capital of Phnom Penh and murdered them as a part of a scheme to eliminate literate Cambodians. Later, many of those who participated in that genocidal act were murdered in a similar way themselves. Intellectuals sympathetic to socialism, wake up, or whatnot, were invited to return to Cambodia to help rebuild the nation. As they left the plains, they were seized and murdered too. Mass graves filled up around the nation until the point was reached that the majority of the population of that nation had been exterminated. Look for something similar, perhaps, happening in the United States. These lefties, these deluded, irrational, unbalanced, drug-addled, overly intellectual, not in the true sense, they are dupes. And once they serve their purpose, they have no purpose. They have no practical purpose. They would absolutely be the worst slaves of a system, wouldn't they? They can't even function in a logical or rational manner at this point. They've given their souls to be what they are, and what they are is completely expendable. The worst part is the manner most of this was done. It was done with clubs, shovels, and rocks. In the last phase, much of the mass murder was done by packs of children in early adolescent years. It was all done under the doctrine of Lin Pao and as an extension of the methods of cultural revolution to that sleepy land of Kampuchea. That is the grisly face of People's War in its near-to-final phases. Brother or sister, butcher, brother or sister, even with so primitive a weapon as a rock, and this occurs on a mass scale. This is People's War. In its next to final phase of escalation, this is cultural warfare in extremity. So if you don't think things could possibly get worse, they can get a lot worse. The Bolshevik Revolution was incredibly bloody. It was an orgy of blood at certain places. This is the form of warfare demanded by the forerunner of Hitler and Bolshevism, Friedrich Nietzsche. That characterization of Nietzsche is no exaggeration. What happened in Cambodia is not new in history. Our first record of such forms of warfare in European history are the practices of the Phrygian cult of Dionysus. Dionysus is one of the dialectical names for Shiv, Satan, whereas Aleister Crowley's anthroposophs chose the name Lucifer as their preferred designation of Satan. Nietzsche, calling himself the prophet of the Antichrist, preferred Dionysus. Dionysus is known also as the forerunner of the modern rock, drug, sex counterculture. The cult of Cybele, who is to Dionysus as the Harappan Shakti Ishtar was to Shiv, was a radical back-to-nature cult which adopted urban civilization as the enemy it proposed to obliterate. Its tactic was to recruit children from the families of the cities into psychedelic cults centered around erotic dancing, drugs, and sexual orgies, and to develop these recruits as terrorist assassins to return to the cities to butcher their parents and siblings. We must not overlook the most essential feature of that cult of Dionysus. The transformation of a child into a terrorist parricide occurs through methods of diabolical forms of cultural warfare. As Nietzsche emphasized, the child is transformed into an instrument of Dionysus through a transformation of values, those axiomatic sorts of underlying assumptions which determine the individual's choices of belief and social behavior. This sort of thing occurs in all those cases. An ordinary person drawn to a socialist organization by some real or imagined issue of injustice is gradually transformed in a deeper way, such that even if he or she breaks that association after a few years, the communist stereotype remains a deeply embedded feature of his or her axiomatic system of underlying values throughout the remainder of life in typical cases. We see this in old Trotskyites and Lovestonites, even among those who broke with Stalin and Stalinism by 1938 or earlier, even those who embedded themselves as purportedly devout anti-communists into the U.S. intelligence services. Let me read that again. Even those who embedded themselves as purportedly devout anti-communists into the U.S. intelligence services, yes, that happened, during and after the last war, radiate that special sort of personal evil in their underlying value systems, which is easily recognized as the Bolshevik stereotype by one sensitive to such distinctions. The point is of such relevance that it deserves restatement. Individuals may be drawn to relevant communistic and social democratic organizations by motives of hostility to perceived injustice. For a time, they may remain representatives of the normal moral system of values which prompted them to enter such an association. Only gradually do most of them become the typical communist hack. There is no difference of any importance between American communists and social democrats on this account. This mental, spiritual quality characteristic of the communist hack is not simply the acquired habit of devotion to the current party line. The change goes much deeper than that. There develops a kind of Dionysiac hatred of the type which the degenerate Hannah Arendt attacked as, quote, the authoritarian personality. A book that was a big hit in the late 50s, I think. Part of the cultural, at that time, some people have understood as a cultural warfare between the new sort of so-called Jewish immigrant culture against the more embedded Catholic culture. The authoritarian personality, the patriarchal male, was under attack at that point. This is, as in Arendt's case, a hatred of the fundamental moral values of Western European civilization. That hatred and the impulse to destroy accompanying it is the deeper system of transformed values which defines the mental type of the communist hack. They do not love truth, beauty, or mankind. They hate the society which produced them and seek to undermine and destroy it. They hate everything which the 1439 Council of Florence affirmed. At this point, we run into what might seem a practical problem, although Moscow since 1962 has adopted Mao Zedong's tactic of drug war against the youth of the United States and Western Europe. Most of the Dionysiac brainwashing done to Soviet advantage was not perpetrated by the Soviets themselves, but by the collaboration between the circles of two of the most evil men of the 20th century, Bertrand Russell and Satan worshipper Aleister Crowley. True, the successful phase of Soviet cultural warfare of Western civilization began with the 1955 London negotiations between Bertrand Russell and Khrushchev's Moscow regime. But Russell did not act as a Soviet agent as such. Russell acted, as did Crowley and the Crowley-Russell crew inside MK-Ultra, as agents of the cultural warfare sections of the Venetian Party. The paradox is only superficial. In the relationship between Moscow on the one side and Russell-Crowley on the other, it is the Russell-Crowley side which has the more direct ties to Satan. Bolshevik Moscow is the golem, and the Venetian Party circles, represented by the London Occult Bureau, and Russell Crowley, agents of the relevant rabbi of Prague. Russell was not a Soviet agent. Personally, he despised the Bolsheviks. Russell represented those in the West who, despising the Bolsheviks, wished Moscow to win. Russell's motives were purely satanic ones. Hence, although it is necessary to look the Soviet adversary relationship straight in the eye, that is no reason to forget that Moscow is merely a golem, and that the magicians who created the Bolshevik golem and continue to deploy it are much closer to home. Perhaps Moscow would destroy the magicians of the Western Venetian Party too. There is a famous story of Tiberius and one of the Magi which bears upon this. It was the custom of Tiberius to take as a guest or an advisor out for a walk along the cliffside pathway, and in the course of that stroll to push them over the brink to their death. One of the Magi priests who attended him was invited for such a stroll. Near the cliffside, Tiberius proposed that the Magus prophesy the emperor's future. Greatly and sincerely agitated, the Magus apologized. "I cannot, sir, for at this moment I am overwhelmed by the foreboding that my own life is in very grave danger." Tiberius promoted him. Yet the lesson stands. Even the creators of a golem stand always in danger of being destroyed by the monster they have unleashed. Were this to be the fate of the modern magicians of Russell's ilk at the hands of the Moscow golem, that would be only just. Perhaps we're seeing that today. I'm saying that very guardedly. Just something that struck me. Unfortunately, under the relevant state of affairs, our children and grandchildren would be in no position to enjoy that bit of justice. From the opposite side, our own, the essential form of warfare is also cultural warfare. The difference is that our adversary wages cultural warfare according to his values, and we ought to flank and envelop in these dimensions in the manner consistent with our values. Cultural warfare is a battle for the mind, addressing the mind on the deepest level, the level of those axiomatic assumptions which determine the individual's and nation's choice of belief and behavior. Since our adversary is gripped by brutish values, his methods of cultural warfare converge upon bestiality. We, on our side, must promote those practices and values which are consistent with the Christian humanist spirit of the Golden Renaissance. Well, I might contest that. I think better things have emerged. Leave it at that. When other means of cultural warfare are insufficient, the affair turns towards supplemental methods of regular warfare. Yet, if our means are strong enough to deter the adversary from the terrible risks of regular warfare, we must hope to win cultural warfare, not by regular warfare, but by our proficiency in the combined cultural, economic, and political means we employ in place of regular war. This puts those, such as the Russell-Crowley circle, rightly in the foremost rank of our deadly adversaries. If we eradicate the evil they represent, securing peace with the grandchildren of today's Russians is more likely. If we do not deal with the cultural adversary at home, we shall certainly all be destroyed, the Soviet Empire soon enough, too, by this planet's early plunge toward the depths of a global new dark age. Venice and the Rabbi of Prague. The Jewish fairy tale does not say this, but it is the truth of that story nonetheless. The Rabbi of Prague made that golem because he was in the grip of evil. Otherwise, he would never have wished to make such a creature. More specifically, he was in the grip of Venice's evil. We refer to two events involving a famous Jewish family of Venice, Luzzatto. The first event occurred during the 13th century when the Luzzatto family propagated the satanic dogma of Kabbalistic occultism as its version of Jewish belief. Thus, the Bogomil Gnostics undertook to perpetrate upon Judaism the same quality of crimes they wreaked upon Christianity. The second event was the same Luzzatto family's 19th century attack upon Moses Mendelssohn, the great philosopher who epitomized the highest quality of achievements of the Western European Ashkenazi Jew. Such crimes against not only Moses, but God himself, were not original to 13th century Venice. It began in Moses' time with the worship of Satan represented as the golden calf, the adoption of the satanic cults of the Canaanites, Phoenicians, led to the destruction of Israel. The influence of Shakti Ishtar became systemized by those scribes of the Babylonian captivity who corrupted the Hebrew writings to bring them into conformity with the mythologies of the Chaldean priests of the whore of Babylon, Ishtar. Matters bearing upon the hope of afterlife are subjects of faith and hence not intelligible to mortal man. Everything else is implicitly intelligible for us. There is no magic in this universe. I don't know about that. In the affairs of mortal men, there is no invisible hand. Well, I agree to that. I agree with that. The invisible hand was conjured out of the evil imagination of British imperialism. That if you convinced people that a kind of phantasmic force out there attended to commerce and sort of magically worked things out, well, then what was being protected from view was the fact that no, there are people in power who orchestrate all of it, including bank failures. These things don't happen by accident. Economic forecasters, it's not like the weather. You can read the signs, you can try to see patterns, but unless you know what certain individuals are up to on a specific day, you really don't know what's going to happen. We each, as individual or nation, are accountable to the Creator for those consequences of our policies and isolated important actions. Such as consequences ought to have been intelligible to us. Satan is a magician, and all belief in magic's efficacy to our individual mortal advantage is purely Satanism. Those, like the Rabbi of Prague, who practice astrology, Kabbalism, and kindred forms of magic are destroyed by it if they do not remedy that error in time. Well, I think he's being a bit dogmatic here. I really do, especially with regard to astrology. I'm really trying to open my mind to a lot of new things, and I appreciate all the help I get, encouraging me to open up. I believe that human potential is infinite, and at this particular time, in my view, we need to recognize dogma, however wonderful and marvelous it appeared to us and however wedded we have been to it in the past, and at least entertain the possibility of functioning without it. And there's something better is going to come along. The many wonderful things have developed since this article was written. So So with this video, we finish up with The Myth of Marxist Communism by Lyndon LaRouche from Executive Intelligence Review, Volume 15, Number 44, November 4th, 1988. What a wild ride. I think I want to continue, but I'm going to get into, I think, the nature, the character of Venice, and why when I talk about the British, I'm not talking about the British people. I'm not talking about anything racial or nationalistic. God, no, absolutely not. I'm talking about a transplanted Venetian culture and methodology and oligarchical construction. So maybe the best thing to do next time is to get into that, but okay.